Good morning. We are going to get started with the second session of this symposium on the Paris Climate Summit and beyond. The first session today was on the Paris Climate Summit, and this session is on beyond. We are going to be talking about the great diversity of international efforts, institutionalized and otherwise, to tackle the climate change problem, to govern efforts to deal with climate change. And it is a big, big space. I would say that if you looked at the climate change landscape 6 or 7 years ago, the general assumption was that the UN talks sat at the center, and there were all sorts of other things perhaps hanging on, but they flowed from it. Today, you have a much wider range of activities related to climate change, ranging from ones at the multilateral development banks, to the World Trade Organization, to the UN, to private sector consortia, bilateral arrangements. And so we're going to try and touch on a bunch of that. We have 3 fantastic panelists to help guide us through this session. To my immediate left is Claudio Descalzi, CEO of Eni, one of the world's largest oil and gas companies. He has been with Eni since, I believe, 1981.
Yes.
And became CEO at the auspicious time of May 2014. So he has had a boring time since then. To his immediate left, Christy Whitman, president of Whitman Strategy Group, former EPA administrator, former governor of New Jersey, and her most distinguished title, member of the Council on Foreign Relations Board of Directors, or at least the one that we derive enormous value from. And on my far left is Dan Price. Dan is managing director of Rock Creek Global Advisors. He was deputy national security advisor for international economics in the George W. Bush White House, and the leading figure at the National Security Council, National Economic Council, in crafting really the second-term strategy on climate change. So we have 3 fantastic people to help us through this session. The session is on the record. That includes not only the conversation up here, but when we get to questions from members, your questions as well. Before we dive into the different pieces of the broader climate change regime, I want to bridge a bit the gap between the first session and this. So Paris is part, or the UN climate talks are part of a broader constellation of international efforts. On a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 is Paris doesn't really matter, to 10, which is Paris is really most of what matters to dealing with climate change, where do you put reality? Claudio, one-word answer.
Yes, just one answer. I think that we have a lot of expectation on Paris, but I think that we are still far from a solution, so I put Paris at 7.
7, okay.
So important.
Slightly lower, I'd go for 6 with Paris.
Okay, and Dan?
7.
Okay. So
thank you.
We are going to have a lot of debate and conflict during this session.
No
sharp disagreements.
Right.
Claudio, expand a bit on why Paris is so central. 7 is pretty close. It's closer to 10 than to 0. If I followed David's math instructions earlier. Why so central?
Why 7? Why 7? Because it's a COP21, so we had already 21 years that we talk about climate change, and for the first time, I think that globally we felt that we have an issue, and we have a strong issue, and most of the players accepted this issue, and at the level of government and companies, they thought and decided that in Paris we have to find a solution. So that is already a very important point. So the perception is stronger than before. And now I think that it is not enough to put targets. We have also to define policies and also how to get this 2-degree limit. And I think that is the big issue, because renewable, that is the future solution is not enough, it's too expensive. In the last 10 years we invested $2 trillion and we increase the contribution of the renewable, I'm talking about eolic and solar, of about 2%. So in the electricity domain, renewable now they account for 3.5%. But we spend 2 trillion. And we have in front of us a big economical, and we have to change model that we built in the last 200 years that is based on fossil fuels. So I think the challenge is important. We have tried to be effective, understand how we can go fast to the solution. And that is the main reason why I say that it's important, because it's strong perception. I'm not sure that we find a global solution on a global agreement and to share how to get it.
Christy, why 6?
I
Why are
say-
you so much more pessimistic?
I am not so much more
So
pessimistic.
very far from
I
saying.
think that, well, my feeling is that Paris is important because it has helped focus the debate. It's brought more countries to the table with concrete proposals than we've had before, and that's important. I mean, it's been a long time since COP21, and we haven't seen the kind of progress that we would have liked to have seen. It's also raised it in the public's mind. You start to see more of the validation of the science, and you see more real numbers. I mean, for instance, when you say that if we continue on the current course, by 2030 there will be 100 million more people, 100,000 more people driven into poverty. And that has all sorts of implications, not just for the displacement of the people and the humanitarian side of it, but also because of what it implies for where they're going to concentrate, what's going to be the unemployment numbers there, and where do people like ISIS go to find their recruits. So it's starting to move across from just this sort of amorphous idea of the climate is changing and, oh, by the way, I as an individual can't do anything about it, to something that's more, gee, the science, first of all, we see it because we see what's happening in the climate around us, and it does have some real implications for us, especially after what went on last week in Beirut and Paris and the plane. The Russian plane. So I think it's important. I would tend to agree that we're not going to see a legally binding international agreement. We may see agreements on broad goals, but the United States has never been one that's been great at stepping up and saying, yes, we'll take an international body to hold us legally responsible. So that's why I gave it a little harsher in my rating.
And Dan, you also said 7, so pretty central.
Yes. I'm answering the question, how important is reaching an agreement in Paris on a scale of 0 to 10? And I would say 7, and I'll explain why in a moment. But in terms of the role of the Paris outcome in fundamentally addressing climate change, I would rate that below 5.
Okay.
So why 7 in terms of importance? 2 things are happening. One, Paris is testing a new model. We have abandoned the doctrinal faith of a globally agreed single emission reduction target that will be allocated top-down. And we've evolved to, I would call it, pledge and review. Although the review piece is not yet worked out, and that's a critical piece. So that's one new feature. The second new feature is the outcome will reflect a degree of cooperation among at least some of the key major players that we have not seen before. So a success in Paris will validate, or could validate, those 2 developments. In terms of why I put it no higher than 5, trade policy, investment policy, mobilization of capital, structural reform in a number of countries, right? We talk about insurance. You know, there's an underinsured population in India. The insurance market is closed to outside investors, largely. So, I mean, there's a lot that's going on the trade and investment front, on the diffusion of technology front, again, also related to robust intellectual property protections, in my view. So there's a lot that needs to happen beyond agreement in Paris if we're to address this problem.
So let's dive into what happens beyond Paris. And Dan, I want to pick up on something you said at the end there, trade policy. What can we expect from trade policy in either helping or hurting our ability to deal with climate change? What should we be aspiring to? Do the trade agreements we're seeing on the table right now, like TPP, have a role to play? Does the potential forthcoming agreement that we might have between the United States and Europe have some role to play?
I think they do. A couple of aspects. And don't forget the Environmental Goods Agreement at the WTO, right? At its most primitive level, lowering tariffs on environmentally friendly products helps the diffusion of them. Our problem multilaterally has been, what do you put in that basket? What is right? Do you put automobile batteries, or does Detroit say no to that? Anyway, so there's been a lot of debate about that basket, but certainly that's one element. If you look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there's a couple of features there which are quite novel. One is the degree of disciplines on state-owned enterprises. So if you want to get at some of the key actors in countries in the energy space, you've got to look at state-owned enterprises. There's another piece in there, and I'll come back to this later, hopefully, new rules on the digital economy. Rules prohibiting data localization or data storage in particular jurisdictions. And as the data richness of our energy efficient technologies, which are going to be a combination of sensors and data analytics, expand, ensuring cross-border data flows is going to be key. Last comment, let me say a word about the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. That is the potential FTA between the United States and the 28 states of the European Union. The centerpiece of this is not so much traditional trade and investment rules as it is the possibility of regulatory cooperation, harmonization, and mutual recognition. A key element to solving energy efficiency, greenhouse gas emissions, is going to be standardization and cooperation among regulators. I query here the impact of the VW scandal on the appetite, at least of the United States, for mutual recognition.
Claudio, Dan talked about the fusion of technologies, which is ultimately at the core of a lot of this. And one of the technologies that people are talking about in the broadest sense is the suite of technologies around natural gas. A piece of the oil and gas industry has really come around this and a broader set of climate issues through a recent announcement on an oil and gas climate initiative. Can you tell us a bit about, and you're a leading player in that, tell us a bit about the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, how it came about, what it is, where you want to see it going.
So, as I said before, that we have there is a new perception about the climate issue, and for the first time, oil and gas company that create CO2 emissions. So they realize that they have to be proactive and do something, or at least showing what they are doing. So for the first time, 1.5 years ago, we started discussing among the first 6 most important European companies to try to be a part of the solution. And we put together, and then also Saudi Aramco and Pemex, so other 2 companies from Saudi Arabia and from Mexico join us. And what I think that the most important step was to recognize the 2 degrees, so the need to reduce the CO2 emissions, that if we are following this trend, also with the engagement already proposed by all the different countries, 147 countries, we are not able to reach the target, because in 2030 we are going to produce 57 gigaton of CO2. That is 35% more than what we expected to reach the 2 degree increase of temperature limit. So we said that we have to play a role. So first of all, we have to recognize the climate change issue. We recognize it. Second, we put in place a list of points like energy efficiency or gas, so switch from coal to gas, and gas flaring, and renewables, and energy mix issue. And we are proposing solutions, and we work together. We work together also in terms of technology that is quite important for the future, like carbon capture and sequestration. That is a way to reduce the impact of CO2 emissions. So that was the reason. I think that is a historical decision that the European company took. And we talk also about another point that is a crucial one, because we said we have to change our economical and energy mix model, but at the same time we have to care about the growing need of a growing population. We have at least 1.2 billion people without access to energy. So access to energy became another important issue in our agenda.
Let me ask you, you have this group of very influential, very powerful companies together. How much can you do through industry cooperation by itself? And how much needs to happen through affecting government policies and changing government policies?
Thank you for the question, because it is a very, very crucial, especially in Europe. I think that to invest in new technology, you must have policy. So you must know stability in terms of fiscal and subsidies, and in the long run. So if you know that, you can invest in new. If you leave the market free, like happened in Europe, Europe is investing about 73 billion euro per year to promote renewable, and we increase the renewable of about 2-3% in the energy sector up to 23%, so it's a huge number. But from the other side, we open our door to coal coming from the US, and we increase the coal disposal utilization of 10% in 4 years. And 1% of coal is deleting the positive impact of 10% of renewable. So so the subsidy on the renewable are promoting or give room to the coal. So in Europe we got, without a policy, a crazy energy mix, renewable and coal. And we didn't change at all our emission policy and perspective. For that reason, policy is absolutely crucial.
Christy, one of the things that's being squeezed there is nuclear. And you've spent a lot of time thinking about nuclear and thinking about the conditions that would allow nuclear to become a larger part of the climate solution. What needs to be done internationally on that front? Because nuclear entails not only the climate regime, but regimes focused on safety, on security. Sure. What are the pieces of governance that need to be put in place to make nuclear work?
Well, there's some 140 nuclear reactors currently under construction or in the licensing stages around the world. And I think the most important thing is we need to be players in it, because our regulatory structure is it is the gold standard. It is we have the most regulated nuclear industry with the highest set of standards of any country in the world. And we want to make sure that we are a player to be able to help influence some of these other countries as they move forward. It's something that is a very good economic tool for us. Right now in China, 4 of their reactors that are being built using the Westinghouse Advanced Processing 1000, and that's already accounted for 15,000 jobs in this country. So it's a win-win. It's not a bad thing, which gets us to trade, and it gets us to the Ex-Im Bank, and the need for a more coherent and cohesive, I believe, plan from our Congress about how we engage with the rest of the world. But particularly if you look at nuclear is the one form of base power that releases no regulated pollutants while it's producing power. And while oil and gas are far better than coal, nuclear they still release the carbon, and they release the other criteria pollutants into the atmosphere. So it needs to be an all of the above strategy. When you look at, particularly in the developing world, in many parts of it, this move now to small modular reactors, or SMRs, really holds out a lot of hope. Those can be built faster, they're much less expensive, they have fewer component parts, they're easier to manage, and they'll range anywhere from probably about 30 megawatts to 500 megawatts. And they can be put down in place. They'll be built inside, transported to where they're going to produce the power. So you can reach places that are off the grid. And in many of the developing countries, because of the use of biomass as a regular form of power and of cooking, and of all the ramifications of that, particularly on women, and women being major drivers of the economic development in countries, when their lifespan is shortened, when they have to spend a lot of time not working for the community, not doing business, going collect wood or dung in order to be able to produce and feed meals and feed their families, you're losing their economic value to the country as a whole. So to me, nuclear is often overlooked because of fears around nuclear. But if you look at the history, the actual history in this country and our regulatory regime, it's been a very safe form of power. And it's been something that's shown to be 90% efficient, runs 90% of the time. It isn't affected by weather extremes in the way some of the other producers are. So it's something that I believe needs to be part of this discussion if we're really going to try to slow down this path that we're on climate change, which is enormously serious.
So one of the things that you emphasized there was this potential role of small modular reactors, so next generation technology, and you talked about US investment there. Does there need to be more international collaboration on investment there, on diffusing that technology? Are we sort of okay with the US taking the lead there and hoping we'll sort it out ourselves?
Well, we always do better when we bring everyone else into the process. I mean, clearly that there's going to be an advantage when you have enough numbers, enough money being put in, enough brains being put to it. There's no one country that has all the answers, but much of the base technology that's been developed even further in France, particularly in France and Japan, came from this country before we got out of the nuclear business in the 70s. But our Department of Energy now has put money aside, a significant amount, for the development of small modular reactors. They have, under the Clean Power Plan, they have opened up the ability to take some money for R&D and for actual construction, particularly for SMRs. But we would all be better off if we're working with the rest of the world. But that gets back to international, how willing are we to trade things? And some of these it's going to involve intellectual property.
And I suspect also it's not just a matter of cooperating to make the innovations, but also getting at least enough regulatory coherence so that a plant that is allowed to operate in one place can actually be deployed somewhere else.
Well, that's one of the advantages, certainly in this country and around the world, under the old regimes that we had. In this country, of the 104 reactors we've had operating over the more than 50-year history of nuclear in the United States, 95 of them use different technologies. So even within one utility company, you couldn't train somebody at one reactor and send them to the next one, because it would be a different technology. Now there may be going to be worldwide 4. And so that is going to make it much easier to harmonize and to move people around and be able to have it. But that's again why we, the United States, want to be involved. We want to be working with these countries as they set up their regulatory structures to make sure that they are adopting some of the most advanced forms of oversight. I mean, just a quick example, after Fukushima Daiichi, what happened was not the earthquake, and I think most people know that, it was the tsunami. And the reason was that they had co-located their backup generators actually in the building with the reactor. After 9/11, our Nuclear Regulatory Commission had identified this as a potential problem and told all of the utilities that had nuclear reactors that they had to move their backup generators to separate buildings. So we really are ahead of the curve in much of this, and we should want to be part of what's going on in the rest of the world.
Dan, I want to shift gears a bit. One of the big criticisms of the UN process has been that, I've lost count, but 190 and some odd countries get together, and who can negotiate anything with 190 plus countries? So I know when you were in government, this was a big focus, and you created the Major Economies meetings to try and deal with that, which was reincarnated as the Major Economies Forum in this administration. Can you talk to us first briefly what that is? But second, now looking back on roughly 10 years of trying to do something in a smaller group, does it offer significant advantages? If it does, what are they? Or has it not lived up to its potential?
Wow, okay. The idea behind the major, we called it the MEM. It was rechristened the MEF. I like the MEF better, the Major Economies Forum. We call it a Major Economies Meeting. But essentially, it was the 17 countries that together constituted 85% of greenhouse gas emissions. And the idea was that if one could reach agreement in principle or agreement on a number of items in that forum, not that you would be prejudging the outcome of the UNFCCC, but that if you could reach agreement on certain items, that could then be socialized within the broader group. I would say over its life, it's had mixed results. Certainly, it served to elevate. I think one of our previous speakers, I think it was David, emphasized the importance of heads of state coming. Well, the meeting of the major economies would coincide in my day with the G8 or the G20, and to have the leaders, and there was an awful lot of overlap between the major economies countries and the G20, to have those leaders together for half a day or a day focused exclusively on issues of climate and energy was quite helpful. I think in the broader context, I mean, you've seen a proliferation of large regional trade agreements, right? TPP is in part a response to the failure of the multilateral system to make progress, principally because of the veto of a number of large emerging markets and the recalcitrance of a number of large developed countries to reach agreement on certain things. So I think both processes are important. Eventually, one needs to get a broad-based consensus, particularly since what we're talking about is fundamentally changing the organization of our economies and human behavior. That can't be done as a group of 17.
So you described this in a way that makes the challenge just seem very, very small. Claudio, when we talk about these major economies, we typically think about the United States, and we think about European countries, we think about China, India. But one of the large ones that's consistently part of the discussion is Saudi Arabia. And there are other major oil exporting countries that matter in these discussions. And I'm struck when I look at the list of companies involved in the new initiative that you've recently released, that Saudi Aramco is part of that.
Yeah.
How did that work? And what insight do you get into how they think about this set of challenges?
I think, first of all, that is a big result, big success to have Saudi Aramco with us. Saudi Aramco is very interested to technological collaboration and cooperation with all the major companies. So they are working on energy efficiency, flaring down, and methane emissions, and so they are working on some of the items that we are working on. It's clear that as European, we are advocating for gas, we are advocating also for carbon pricing, ETS or EPS, and maybe we are not sharing exactly the same kind of solution in this case, but it's part of the dialogue. So I think that then every country, talking about the consensus, a large consensus, a lot of countries together, I think that every country has a different solution for the climate change. It's clearly that there are some points from our point of view that, for example, is carbon pricing or APS, that is emission performance standard, that we have to apply. Otherwise, we cannot cope with the reduction of CO2 emissions. We have to discuss between us, but we have also to create champion. I'm talking about the case of the UK and US, for example. UK, in Europe, they've been they've been the most successful in reducing emission. What they apply the APS, so the emission performance standard, that is practically an indirect carbon pricing that touch the most polluted plants, like the coal plants, and in few years they create a different kind of energy mix based on gas and renewable, and they've been able to reduce 25% the emissions in UK. And that is a champion, is an example. In the US, you reduce about 10%, because you change the energy mix, renewable, you have still coal, but you create a new renewable and gas, less coal. So I think that we have to find a consensus. We have to discuss about the solution. I don't think that we don't have time to discuss too much. That is the issue, because in 2030 we have to cut about 35% of our emissions, and we have to follow also some champion. And that is the case. UK, the US, Europe is the worst case, because we put together. So I think that we need rules and policy, and we share this point. Saudi Aramco and Pemex has other kind of objectives. They don't have a big emissions, so they have a different kind of objectives, that is energy efficiency and the energy mix, for example.
I'm struck that in each of your comments you talk about standards as being important. It's not typically the stuff of high politics and summitry. You don't come out and say we have a new set of technical standards, but it's hard to come away from this discussion without concluding that actually standards are critical for advancing technology and for helping it spread more rapidly. We might do well to find ways of accelerating change on that front. Claudia, I have one last question for you, and then I want to open things up to members for questions. So we're talking a lot about governance, about policies, about initiatives. But this all happens overlaid on huge market-driven changes. And your industry has seen enormous market-driven changes in the last year. Weigh the relative importance of these two pieces to us. If you think, for example, about the collapse in oil prices versus the progress on policy, which one's going to influence our ability and willingness to decarbonize more?
I think that we need both. I think that we need both in the sense that we need standard policy, and going to the low price, oil price, I think that that is helping to create more efficiency. We are cutting costs. We are more energy efficient, and that is a result, and that is impacting CO2 emission and climate change. And we are working more on gas, because gas is decoupling. So gas is no more linked to oil. Right. So oil dropped down, but gas less down. So I think that this situation creates an anomalies that I'm not happy about the low price, but I think that is in a sense is pushing us toward a different energy mix.
But we're clear for any shareholders, you are not happy about the low oil.
No, I'm not happy.
Okay, just to be clear.
I can, yes.
Okay.
Say aloud.
We are going to turn now to questions from members. A reminder that this conversation is on the record. Put up your hand, I'll point to someone. You will be brought a microphone. Please speak directly into it. Stand, state your name and affiliation, and have a quick, sharp question so we can bring as many in as possible. Ruben, gentleman on the right side of the aisle here.
Thank you. Ruben Cryam, Covington and Burling. For Mr. Descalzi, in comparing the carbon budget, so to speak, the amount of carbon that could be put into the atmosphere within the expectations of temperature increase that we can live with, and comparing the resources, the fossil fuel resources that we have on hand or in reserves. People have come up with this notion of stranded assets.
Yeah.
I take your point with respect to the replacement of coal, and that, of course, makes a big difference for the oil and gas companies. But even assuming that natural gas replaced coal to a substantial degree. How do you think of the stranded assets issue, and what can the industry be doing to address that prospectively? Thank you.
Well, thank you. The stranded assets, when we talk about fossil fuel and we talk about stranded assets, I think that we have three different modules. So the first real stranded asset is coal, clearly, for the long run. And when you go to the oil and gas companies, and we work on in terms of reserves, on the 2P reserve, that is a subset of the fuel resources. And the lifetime is less than 18 years, 15 years. So our 2P reserves, for that reason we make exploration every day, because our lifetime is very short. And it's clearly inside the 30, 40, 50, 60 years where we have to change our energy mix. So I don't think at all that we have a problem of stranded assets. We have some problem of stranded assets for marginal price, but they're already stranded now because they are too expensive. It's not for climate reasons. So I think that is a issue that is not well positioned when you talk about stranded. It's clear that you look at 100, 200 years. We have coal, then we have oil, and then we have gas. Gas, we need gas because we have to replace all the different kind of resources, and it's faster and cheaper. And especially when you look at Africa, for example, where we have 600 million people without energy, but they have gas. So they have to use this gas. We have to help them to use this gas to create development and access to energy. So when you talk about this kind of stuff, you have to look at the different geography, at people that they don't have energy at all. They are using biomass, as we said before, that causing 4.5 million dead people every year. And so I think that we have to look at without any ideology, but we must be very pragmatic.
Gentleman here on the left.
Carter Page, Global Energy Capital. I have a follow-up question to some of the things that Mike was discussing with Claudio. Can you say a little bit more in terms of your strategy in the Middle East, just in dealing with many of the state-owned enterprises and governments there? They obviously have a great respect for you, and you've built great partnerships. Can you say a little bit in terms of finding the balance between the various tracks that you're talking about, particularly with respect to oil versus some of the more carbon neutral strategies you've been talking?
So Middle East, I think that's our strategy was really more African and North African and some Middle East countries. But with the gas discovery we made, because now we are changing also our energy mix, oil and gas. And with the Middle East, we are working a lot, and especially in the Eastern Mediterranean hub, to create a strong gas alternative for Europe. And we are working together. And that is quite interesting because it's in line with the climate change target, because we are promoting gas. We are promoting gas in Egypt, in Cyprus, and recently we are discussing with Israel a lot, because they find a lot of gas, and the existing Egyptian infrastructure will be perfect to build on an export strategy. And this region is growing. It's an old one region for Egypt, but it's growing because we already found 3,000 billion of cubic meters with a target 6,000 billion of cubic meters. So it can create a strong change, step change for climate change, for gas utilization in Europe. We have we have an expectation to increase about 200 billion of cubic meter per year, so to reach 680 billion of cubic meter, and we are now at 40 and something. So there is a big gap to fill, and this region is working together. So it's not just an economic or an industrial alliance, but became a physical link between countries that before didn't talk too much together, like Egypt, Cyprus, Israel, in the future Libya, because it's part of this hub. So how economy and industry can change also the geopolitical connection. And that is I think that is very positive for development, for climate change, and for energy mix.
Christy, this discussion of countries with sort of less capacity reminds me of something that Lena said earlier. You know, India has a lot of goals that it's excited about, but can't necessarily meet them. And one of the things that is less prominent that the EPA does is it works with partners around the world to make them more effective regulators, make them more capable of actually achieving the things that they want to achieve. Are we doing enough to help others be able to achieve the goals that they're already interested in? And we typically think of climate talks as trying to harangue other folks into wanting to do more. How about helping them do more of what they already want to?
Unfortunately, right now, we're not, because the agency is being totally hamstrung by the Congress. Their budget has been cut dramatically. The number of people are retiring and leaving, and so there is not a lot left to do that kind of work. And we have a Congress that is constantly calling members of the agency up on the Hill to testify on a whole host of different subjects, and that takes away a lot of time and a lot of focus on the issues that need to be addressed. We were more proactive in the past, I believe, than we have been. There is an office within EPA that just deals with those international involvements, and their budget's tight. They can't do the same kind of travel. It's fine with modern technology. You can do a lot with FaceTime and Skype and things like that, but that's not the same. You've got to be there, particularly when you're developing these very sophisticated standards, because we've got to understand the cultural differences. It's fine to say, this is how we do it, and it protects everything and it's great, but that's not how it's always going to be able to be implemented in other countries. And you don't get that over the phone or over the internet. You have to be on the ground, and we just don't. Right now, we're not participating, I do not believe, in the way that we should or could.
Teresa.
You're right.
Frustrating.
Thank you. My question is on trade and standards, so for Daniel Price. I hear an increasing concern coming from the civil society in Europe on the negotiations on the TTIP. In a very simplified manner, their concern is this is a treaty that could freeze current standards, being combined with any company in a position to claim for protection for their previous investments, in a context where what we need to promote is a progressive trajectories on new standards in order to change current solutions. So very in particular on the energy and sustainability chapters. So my question is how we can promote or how we can use these instrumental fields, financial regulation, trade instruments, in order to promote action going beyond the existing standards and being a positive force into the new type of investments we need.
Thank you for that question. Let me comment on two aspects of it. You're absolutely right. Certain civil society groups in Europe have been protesting. I think there were 150,000 in the streets of Germany against TTIP. This was Angela Merkel's brainchild initially.
The agreement, not the 150,000.
Right. The agreement. Thank you.
To be clear.
I think the anxiety is more broadly based than just about TTIP or just about investor state. There's an element of global insecurity because of the slowness of the economic recovery from the financial crisis. There is a loss of confidence in institutions and elites. So I think there's a lot that underlies this anxiety. I think the particular concerns you identified, that is, that regulatory cooperation will be a race to the bottom, not a race to the top, and the concern about the ability of an investor to bring a claim against the host government for damages, I think those two particular concerns are totally unfounded. And the issue has been largely demagogued. Taking the second one first, there is not a single case under the more than 3,000 treaties that presently exist, not a single case in which a non-discriminatory, generally applicable health, welfare, or environment measure has been found to violate a treaty. Not one case. We see lots of demonstrations and protests when a Canadian company called Methanex brings a claim against the United States because California bans an additive, and lots of protests and demonstration, but they lost. People don't take to the streets and say, hooray, the system worked as planned. So I think there is a burden of proof on the other side that is yet to be discharged. In terms of regulatory cooperation, I would say the same thing. You know, you talk to regulators in Europe pre-VW, and they were very concerned about, you know, are US regulators rigorous enough? Do they have too cozy a relationship with the private sector? You talk to regulators in the United States, and they say, well, look, there's 28 states in the European Union. We could see doing something with the big countries like, oh, say the UK, or France, or Germany. And now they pause. They had thought the concerns were at the periphery, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, etc. Now it turns out there are other concerns. But I would say the negotiators on both sides are committed to mutual recognition where it makes sense, right? If it's fish safety and you test the water and I test the fish, but our outcomes in terms of safety are comparable, our data sets are comparable, should we not explore that? Does that necessarily lead to a lessening of consumer protection, or does it lead to a promotion of engagement on products, services, and standards? So yes, there have been lots of protests, in my view, unfounded on any factual basis, and largely accounted for, I think, for reasons other than the pendency of these negotiations.
So you think that it could promote better standards?
The follow-up is, could it promote better standards?
And the answer is absolutely. You know, there's a lot of problems in Europe, migration, Eurozone, but there's also some bright spots. Energy market union, capital markets union, digital single market. And core to all of these is greater integration among the 28 and a kind of standardization across the 28, which will make it easier to promote global standards.
Gentleman in the second to last row there.
Charles Frank, Brookings. I'd like the panel to say what they think about about carbon pricing, either in the form of a tax on carbon or a cap and trade system. How important is carbon pricing to reaching the goals of, say, 2 degrees Celsius? And will there be any discussion of that issue in Paris? I know we're talking about beyond Paris, but maybe you can also indicate beyond Paris, where do we go with carbon pricing?
And since we're focusing on governance in particular, let me put a spin on that. To the extent that different states pursue different tools, carbon pricing through taxes, cap and trade, other measures, how important is it that they actually harmonize what they're doing? Maybe quick answers so we can get a few more. But Christy wanted to start on that.
Well, I mean, I happen to think it's very important, and we did see back in 2007 when you had the leaders of major industrial companies standing up with the leaders from the major environmental groups saying, regulate us on carbon, because we need to have harmonization, trying to meet standards in 50 different standards in 50 different states. is just a nightmare, not to mention the international companies and looking at what they have to meet around the world. So I believe it is very important. It is something that can be done, but we put a lot of objects in our own way. I think what you'll see going forward is we're going to see more of the RGGI type approach, where you have regional agreements, and the Western states also have a trading thing. We are an enormously price-sensitive country, and unfortunately, fortunately for you, when prices went up, people went to smaller cars. The minute gas prices went down, everybody's back in their SUVs again, and you wanted to raise your hand and say, hey, not only could you still save money by being in a Prius, but you could also be helping the world and the earth, because cars, as we know, are huge emitters. So price sensitivity is very great, and for my mind, having seen the stutters and starts we've had with cap and trade and the CEPP, that the new regulation, the Clean Power Plan regulation, allows for states to either determine they're going to achieve their goals through regulations specific to the utilities or a broader carbon reduction. And that gives them the flexibility which states need, because they're all very different. But on the other hand, I think if you're going to see real change, it'll be a tax on carbon rather than a cap and trade, because that's had such a sporadic history and it's very hard to really implement in a successful way. So, but I don't see any appetite for it, by the way, in Congress.
Claudio, is that what you and your peers are looking for? Does harmonization matter?
First of all, I think that we need to have a carbon pricing, or APS, or a sort of cost for the CO2 that your CO2 emissions. But we don't need distortions. What happened in the last 10 years, that the only continent that accepted to apply a carbon pricing was Europe. Then we failed because the ETS is so cheap that it doesn't count. But what happened, that we apply carbon price, we set the 2020 target, so 20 reduction of emission, 20 more efficient, and then we create an energy system very expensive. We pay energy more than three times than you pay in the US. So when we talk about carbon pricing or carbon tax, it's something that have to consider competitiveness for each country, because if you apply in your country, you are not supplying worldwide, you don't solve the problem, because Europe account for 8.6% of the total emissions. If you look at India, China, and US, they account for 52%, and there is no carbon pricing. There is no carbon pricing, there is no carbon tax. We have in Europe, we have in Norway. Now we have very strong and very efficient APS in UK, but we create a monster where we have carbon pricing, we spend a lot on renewables, so we create an energy price that is not sustainable. So we want to have a carbon pricing, efficient and effective one, but we have to find an agreement with other countries where the emissions are more important, because we have to avoid distortion in the competitiveness for our industry. Otherwise, we kill ourselves.
Dan, you talk to a lot of different companies. Is consistency across jurisdictions important? Where does it rank in this space compared to, let's say, not wanting to be overly burdened?
I would say all of the above. But one of the questions that is not yet addressed, whether it's an energy market union in Europe or in this broader discussion, is how much latitude should countries have for choosing energy source? I mean, is it okay for the major economy of Europe to say no nuclear? What if the top 50 economies of the world made that same choice? So I realize this is largely a matter of domestic politics, but if we're going to be prescriptive on goal and agree on what that goal is, Isn't it the case that one state's energy choice will then affect all of the other countries? And so as we think about this going forward, a question is, how much latitude ought there to be?
Lucas.
Is it on? Lucas Haynes, David Rockefeller Fund. So to build on that question, Daniel, can you imagine the Major Emitting Economy Forum as a place where those countries go sector by sector, major emissions sources by sources, and agree on a set of policies, regulations to be harmonized for driving deeper cuts?
Well, that's a very interesting question. During the time that I was involved with the major economies process, we were looking at that. Aluminum, ocean vessels, aviation, iron and steel. So the answer is yes. And this sectoral approach is one that a number of countries favor, and indeed a number of industries favor as well.
Claudio, there have been some discussions within the oil and gas industry toward doing this on methane emissions from natural gas. Is that right?
Yeah, yes. There is a big, but just because of forum, I think that before talking about, I think that we have too many forum. With too many meetings, you have 21 COP, so 21, without solving anything. I think that we have to simplify. We have to find different solutions, because gathering together and talking without solution is useless. So I think that we have to fight and kill all the forum. That is the first thing. No, it's a petition. I want to kill all the forum. No, I think I'm joking.
No,
because I have to express.
How will we host meetings here if we get rid of all the forum?
But that is not the forum. That is not the forum. I'm talking about different forum. So no, I think that we're talking about methane emissions and all. That is a big issue in the U.S. We have some issues also in Europe, and that is still more important than CO2 emission, because it's methane fugitive emission is at least 86 times stronger and more polluted than CO2 emission, and cause nowadays 3 gigaton per year of, so it's very harmful. We are working on that, and we are investing, and we use common technology. That is a case where we put together our technology, and we work together, and we share technology.
And by the way, EPA is in the process now of finalizing their regulations on methane, because it is much more polluting in a smaller area. It tends to fall closer to home, as it were. It doesn't transport quite the way carbon does, but it's major.
A final, very short question before we go to lunch break. Microphone, please.
My name is Sally Cater, and I represent the U.S. Federation for Middle East Peace at the United Nations office. This is for Claudio. Given the situation in Libya and the division, the two governments, and so how are you handling the situation there vis-a-vis structure in oil and gas and all of that, and the safety of it? Thank you.
And let me put a tiny footnote, and you have all these day-to-day pressures, like what's just been described in Libya. How do you make climate change something you focus on regularly, as opposed to the distant piece that you can put off to the next day?
The first answer about Libya. No, we are not handling the situation. The situation is handling us. So just a quick answer. Why we are in a good situation? The situation is handled us positively, because we made a strategic choice in the past not to sell out, export all the gas we produce. Now, 60% of the gas we are producing, we are delivering to access to energy. So Libyan, they grow very quickly in energy sector. In 4 or 5 years, during the civil war, they passed from 400 million cubic meter gas disposal for energy to 4.5 billion cubic meter per year. So now we are supplying all the power sector in Libya. And that is one of the reasons why our installation is not shut down. But we create a positive situation from an energy point of view, and that is access to energy. So we transform, they transform, they're very smart to do that, to all the oil or coal plant in gas plant. And then it's a positive situation for us because we produce gas. So you said, so how I think the two things can work together because we are, when you, the energy mix and the climate change, and when you make choice in the territory, especially Africa, where we work, to change the energy mix and to promote gas, and Libya is the case. You can do both. So you can create a good environment, a good step toward the environment, and give energy, and sometimes survive, and sometimes live in a good situation, a good way.
So it's very much about bringing it from the 40,000-foot level and integrating it into what you do. And I think that's been a theme throughout all of the different elements of the global regime complex, as academics say, for climate change. If you didn't think before this session that there was a lot more to climate governance than the Paris talks, I trust you'll have changed your mind by now. First, please join me in thanking our three panelists.
Adriana